The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. Alexandra Palace, located in Alexandra Park in North London, has seen a lot of history since it opened in 1873. It's been through 2 fires, served as an internment camp during the First World War, and saw the launch of the first ever television broadcast service. Now the palace is being restored, and its Victorian theatre, built in 1875, is one of the centerpieces of that restoration. Today we're joined by James White, who's the consultant curator on the Alexandra Palace restoration. James, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So the Alexandra was originally known as the People's Palace. What can you tell us about this complex in terms of its original appearance and function? And then how did the theater fit into that context?
Sure. So the background was in the Great Exhibition of 1851, which was the Crystal Palace. And when they moved it down to Sydenham in South London, it proved to be this massive success, both popular and money-making. So they saw an opportunity to do the same in the north, and they used the buildings from a later exhibition, the 1862, and moved them onto the top of a hill in Muswell Hill in London. And so the original palace was slightly different to what we see today. It had this big central dome and these 2 wings, and across the one wing had a theatre, which weirdly sort of intersected this great hall going across the palace. But unfortunately that only survived for 16 days and burnt to the ground. And then they built a second one in the place, and it's slightly different formatted in that it's now a unique theatre within the complex, and then we've got separate halls around the rest of the building. So that has been there since 1875, but didn't prove to be quite so commercially popular, so it's had a rather disjointed history.
Now, how did people use just the palace at large? Not just the theater, but what did people come there to do?
So the aspiration of these Victorian entrepreneurs was that they were going to provide entertainment and leisure exercise for the burgeoning population of Victorian industrial London. So partly where the People's Palace comes into it is that it was always designed for every bit of the population. So there was high arts, and there was art galleries, exhibitions of ceramics and sculptures and paintings, and there was the theatre, and their aspiration originally was they would put on, great opera and important plays.
And away from high art, it was a place of leisure and recreation. So we had a race course known colloquially as a frying pan for its unusual shape, where it had the straight going out and a large circle for the majority of the course and a short return straight, and that became rather renowned for being a corrupt or dodgy course. There was also cricket and football, tennis, all different sports in the park. In the palace, there was lots more music, there was organ performances, there was a couple of other smaller stages inside and outside. There was a lot of novelty acts that performed there, so daredevils like Charles Blondin, who was a tightrope walker who went across the Great Hall and did a fake stumble and managed to make a woman faint below him. There was Dolly Shepherd and Professor Baldwin, who were Edwardian daredevils who used to jump out of air balloons above the park and parachute down to earth. And there was a lot of variety that went on at the palace. So music hall actually turned out to be quite popular in the Alexandra Palace Theatre, despite it being a very big theatre itself. And there were things like performances in water tanks and lots of kind of different oddities that the Victorians and Edwardians seemed to be drawn to. There was also an aviary, animals, not really zoo, but sort of performing bears, a lot of types of performances that we wouldn't really necessarily think of as appropriate nowadays. And then a lot of it was about spectacle. It was about really making it big and exciting for the population. And so one of the biggest attractions was very early on, they built a replica of Pompeii and Mount Vesuvius on the lake, and they used to blow it up nightly with a fireworks show. And they used to employ actors, including children actors, which again we probably wouldn't do today, to run away from the falling buildings that were chucked at them and dive into the lake and swim across screaming, which apparently went down very well. And the following year they did it again with the Spanish Armada. So that was a popular one. And it's interesting that a lot of the things like that continue today. So fireworks is, again, a very big thing that we do every year. And it's what a lot of people know Ali Pali for. And because it was known as the People's Palace and it's this place of public meeting, there's been a lot of significant events there. So during a speech that Mr. Churchill was making at Alexandra Palace at one point, he was interrupted by male supporters of the suffragettes who were quickly removed from the place. And it's really kind of hit the zeitgeist of the time. So much later in the 1960s, actually 50 years ago this year, 1967, it hosted the 14-hour Technicolor Dream, which was basically the launch event of the Summer of Love in the UK. And it was organised as a fundraiser by John Hopkins for the International Times, which was an underground magazine. And he managed to get some of the great acts of the 1960s there. But it was one of those events where everyone was there. John Lennon was there with his friend. Yoko Ono was actually performing. And it culminated at sunrise. Pink Floyd played. As the pink light streamed through the window, Syd Barrett reflected it off his silver Telecaster into the audience. And by this point, they were all obviously very spaced out and thought it was, the most important thing that had ever happened. But that really then kicked off the next phase, which was music, and that's very much also what we're known for today. So in the 60s, we had the Rolling Stones, we had Led Zeppelin, Queen, T-Rex, The Who, Judas Priest, Black Sabbath. Then in the 80s, Siouxsie and the Banshees, The Jam, The Stranglers. In 1989, the Stone Roses played their first major London gig at the Height of Manchester, which was, a really important music event. Then in 94, Blur launched Parklife from there, which created the sound of Britpop. We then hosted Brit Awards, MTV Awards, MOBO Awards. So had people like Madonna, Metallica, Pet Shop Boys, all passing through. And then more recently, Bjork, Jay-Z, big name DJs, and we hosted the first UK Afropunk last year. So it's interesting that although these are very eclectic and different things, that's what Alexandra Palace is known for, and it's always been this mixing pot where there's been high and low, and it's all been for everyone at all times.
The Alexandra Palace was also used in a number of ways that reflect the turbulent history of Britain in the 20th century. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So in 1900, the Park and Palace were put into trust for the nation by an Act of Parliament, which meant they were able to stay open more regularly than they had been when they were reliant on being income-generating businesses. Certainly the park was very popular, and the palace and its theatre continued along the same model as it had done before. All of that, however, changed in 1914 when, as it was now in public ownership, it was requisitioned and became a processing department for refugees fleeing from Belgium and the Netherlands. Later that year, it was transformed again into an internment camp for German, Austrian and Hungarian citizens living in the UK. And it became an internment camp for them for about 3,000 men over the 4 years of the war. And the theatre during this time was used as a chapel for the internees. And interestingly, in the intervening period, there had been the arrival of cinema. And Alexandra Palace had very early cinema in the form of bioscopes. But around 1906, there was actually a cinema projection box installed on the balcony at Alexandra Palace. And actually that remains there today, which is, again, part of one of the many rare survivors at Alexandra Palace, and it's going to be part of the restoration, obviously not able to be put back into use, not with the modern projectors. But they were being shown films, and in reports that we have, they say that Charlie Chaplin films were very popular with the internees. But interestingly, we've just digitized our archive at incredible resolution, and it's available online to see. And one of the images we have is a pile of laundry that was given by Londoners for use for the refugees and internees. And in the background, you can't see it with the naked eye on the original print, but we scanned this photograph and put it into the computers. And you can dive all the way into the background, and in the background is a film poster, and it lists the films that were being shown. And interestingly, it's footage, that's sort of real-life footage shot in battles that showed what was happening on the continent to those in the UK. And it's quite surprising that that was being shown to internees at Alexandra Palace. And it's really making us rethink elements of our history by really investigating it properly, thoroughly for a first time. Then, after the Second World War, there had been a lot of damage to the palace, especially some of the main features of it. So the Grand Willis organ, a big organ in the hall by the same makers of that, the Albert Hall, was severely damaged, and there was lots of repair that needed doing to the palace. So it wasn't until 1922 that it reopened. And at this point, the theatre was redecorated, very much more ornate, and a man called Archie Pitt took over the lease. And he was the husband of Gracie Fields, who was a very popular variety performer in the UK. And it was used almost exclusively for preparing her shows ahead of a West End transfer or for tour. And there's talk of her, sleeping at Ali Pali, and rumour has it that she was the one that coined the name Ali Pali, which is colloquially what most people refer to Alexandra Palace as. Also in the time, there was an amateur operatic and dramatic society based at the theatre, and again we knew very little about that. And once we started this restoration, the granddaughter of the star of those shows, a woman called Nancy Macmillan, came forward and said that she'd got all of the papers of her grandmother's. So now we have the photographs and postcards and flyers and programmes, which is amazing to see what the shows actually were like from performers rather than the audience's point of view. And really lovely items like the good luck cards in the flowers on opening night. So that's really opening our eyes to different uses of the theatre at different periods. But again, that all changed in 1935 when the BBC took the lease of the entire East Wing of Alexandra Palace. And although the television studios were put into former dining rooms, the theatre was used as a workshop and a warehouse where the flats, the backdrops, and the scenery and props were stored for the television productions. And because it was a warehouse, it just was bashed around, it got quite damaged over time, and it wasn't really cared for. There was plans pre-Second World War for it to become the third television studio, and we have, again, designs for those in the archive. And unusually, it would have had a central podium in the middle of the theatre auditorium where cameras could have pointed out to different sets around the room. So, yeah, television in the round. It's an incredibly unusual layout, quite innovative, but with the interruption of war in 1939, all of those plans were mothballed. And when the service restarted in 1946, they realised that it was going to grow much faster than anyone could have even predicted a few years earlier, and so they looked at another site for the future studios. But the BBC continued to use the theatre as a warehouse and continued to produce television all the way till 1980, following a massive fire that destroyed a huge part of Alexandra Palace. They left the following year, and then it was mothballed, and it's just been sat waiting for someone to have the money and the time to get it back on its feet, because it is a major project to actually get it back to a usable state.
What does the theatre at the Ali Pali look like, and what makes it so unique?
Well, it looks like a bit of a state at the moment, to be honest. It's not been used in the last 80 years. So it was originally described as a drafty shoebox, which is rather unkind. But it's a rectangular, very flat, square auditorium with a single balcony. Originally there was a second one, which we think was taken down in about 1907. We have the second one, and then up until recently a quite steeply raised floor. And it was it was very plainly decorated originally in the Victorian era. It was flat walls, flat plasterwork, and then painted decoration on top of that. Then in the 1920s, all this ornate plasterwork was overlaid on top of it, and it was repainted, and a big chandelier is now sadly gone, and quite spectacular. But in 1934-35, the BBC took over that part of the palace and started using it for storage. And the theatre was closed at that point, and it wasn't looked after. They bashed it around using it as a warehouse, basically. And it just decayed over time, so the plasterwork was falling off. the paint is stripping back, which is actually quite interesting because it's beginning to show us the Victorian scheme behind the 1920s. And the stage itself was completely mothballed. And it was only in 1980 that the BBC left. And for the past 30 odd years, it's just been waiting for someone to do something. And so it's looking pretty shoddy, but it's kind of beautiful for that. It's got a unique aesthetic, which we're aiming to keep as we restore it. So making it usable, making it safe, but keeping that kind of lost space that someone has just walked into for the first time in a long time.
You've mentioned in a few ways that the theater has a bit of a checkered history. Could you tell us a little bit about how it was used before it was a storage space? What did people go there to see? How well did they sell tickets for that?
Yeah. So the theatre is obviously part of Ali Pali, and Ali Pali is a very big complex on top of a hill in North London. So the aspirations were maybe a little bit over optimistic. It's a very big theatre. It's originally seated about 3,000. The new capacity will be about 1,300. But the first production they put on was something called Minerva, where she was descending from the heavens to create the arts and sciences. And in those first few years, what they did was really exploit the technology of Victorian stagecraft. So one of the, gems that we have at Alexandra Palace is that the stage mechanism is intact. So we have lots of traps, staff traps, coffin traps, fly towers, lots of originally rigging for people flying across the stage. And the early performances were based on this spectacle. So they did put on these big productions that they thought were very worthy, but that wasn't necessarily the clientele that they were actually bringing up. And what proved more successful and more popular were pantomimes. So the first one was The Yellow Dwarf, and then there were more classical ones. But it was in the era of the Harlequinade, where a glitter curtain would come across the stage, and there'd be this quick transformation where all the scenery would change, and the characters would change, and it would come back magically transformed into a new space, sort of within an instant. And that was what was most successful, and that was what really drew the audiences up there to see this kind of almost engineering as much as art. And they did that throughout the Victorian period, these big spectacles every Christmas. And in between that, it was often used for music, to different levels of performances. But it was renowned for being a difficult theatre, so they called it quite drafty, then quite stuffy in the summer. And unfortunately, the sound coming from the stage doesn't really transfer into the auditorium very well. So it really required something visual and something visually spectacular. And that's why sort of pantomime, something that could be easily read, seems to have probably done a bit better than normal straight plays.
Now, you mentioned that it's in a bit of a state right now, this theater. What's the process like for going about restoring a facility like this, and what sort of challenges do you face?
Well, probably the biggest challenge is to keep what is so special about it. The fact that it looks like it is this, long lost gem. It's to kind of keep that atmosphere whilst making it new. That's kind of the biggest thing, because it's very tempting to pull down the ceiling and put on a new one because it could fall on someone's head. But equally, you're not going to get that sense of awe. So there's lots of logistics in terms of putting in a lot of steel work that needs to go in there in order to support the rigging for big shows, and they're going to have to be big shows. When it opens, I think it's going to be within the top 20 in terms of size for London theatres. So it really has to have quite big infrastructure going in. So things like the floor rake was too great to be logistically sensible, really, for the different types of performances we want to put in. So we had to flatten that, but making sure that we took up all the floorboards, that they're numbered, to make sure that they go down in exactly the same position. And making sure that the steelwork, when it goes in, disappears behind what is already there, and that the plasterwork is not restored, but secured. So those are the biggest things. It's more kind of maintaining the feel of it. But then there's the same problems that you hit in every theatre. I mean, the Victorians did not expect the amount of technology that we'd put in today. They put the best technology of the era, and we still have surviving chunks of early electric lighting there. But obviously none of that we could use. So it's putting in all of that into a space that already exists. It's pretty tricky.
Yeah, and I'm wondering a little bit about what you do as a curator. I mean, what's your specific role in all of this?
So I sit in the project to kind of tell the history, but it's not from a historic angle, if you see what I mean. So it's more talking about the legacy of what was happening in the Victorian time and why that's relevant, and making that work for Alexandra Palace as a business. So communicating the fact that we have this amazing theatre, and that in the Victorian era we had all of these traps and how they worked, and how significant it is that they survive today, where that's, incredibly rare. There's very few survivors in the world. So it's making people aware of that story, but also making it relevant to them. So Alexandra Palace has this long storied history of technology and innovation, and saying that what was spectacular to audiences in the Victorian era was this quick transformation at the end of a pantomime, which was enabled by this technology. But that is the equivalent of what the BBC did in the 1930s, bringing television, which was this complete unknown, this spectacular new invention which revolutionized entertainment. And then again, we had Skepta last year, hot off the back of winning a Mercury Music Prize, and that was streamed live by Apple. So it's kind of bringing that story and embedding it within Ali Pali to make it relevant to the audiences we have today, rather than it being a history lesson.
Now, going forward, speaking of the future rather than of history, what's the plan for the theatre and for the Palace at large?
Well, the theatre's going to open September next year. We're booking in the first season at the moment, and there's some really exciting major productions, which, as long as we get locked down, will be spectacular. So that will be the centerpiece of a restoration. So the theatre really is the jewel that's coming out of it. But it's part of a wider plan to restore the east wing of the palace. It's 7.5 acres worth of building, so it's necessarily going to have to be staged. But the theatre will open, and with it, a great Victorian conservatory. And with that, we'll be able to provide cafes, a learning space, retail, just a public space, which at the moment we're lacking. And the theatre's able to give us a reason to open that with a bang. And so when the theatre opens, it will be available for major productions. And definitely within the first sort of season, we're going to experiment with the type of production we can put in there, because it hasn't been used in 80 years. And because we're a company that's done a lot of different events anyway, we're quite comfortable about putting in different types of performances and attracting different audiences. So there should be quite a lot of different things that are going in there, but also making it a useful, viable space. So it's designed that we can have theatre seating, but it'll also be theatre and round, thrust, cabaret, usable for weddings, for exhibitions, for launches, or for, more intimate gigs. So certainly the first season is going to be quite experimental in terms of figuring out what we can do with the space. And then the rest of the palace is a big, big project. So we're also looking at the BBC's television studios, and looking at the most exciting thing that we can do there. Again, trying to avoid creating a television museum. I mean, they already exist. So it's creating something that is unique to our site, that is innovative, that is bringing in creative and future-minded sort of entrepreneurs, businesses, and really reinvigorating the parts of the history that made it great. And then folding that across the rest of the business and the site. So making sure that when the theatre opens, it's not operating as an addition to a building that exists, but making sure it's part of a wider offering of exciting entertainment at Alexandra Palace.
We'll post a link to more information about the Alexandra Palace, as well as images of the theatre there, in our show notes. James, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Oh, no, thank you. It's I love getting a chance to talk about the theatre, because it's closed at the moment. So much of my job is talking about it rather than showing it. So it'll be great when we can actually open it and start watching stuff there.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheatreHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.